This presentation provides an example game of Neu-Divisions-Kommandeur or Neu-Divisional-Kommandeur version 2 using a summer 1939 scenario with the Germans attacking the Polish position for the first half of the game, followed by a Polish counterattack. The Polish are defending with an infantry division, with the Germans attacking with a panzer division. The playing area is 90 centimetres wide by 60 centimetres deep, with the Polish forces allowed to deploy anywhere except within 20 centimetres of the German player edge. The Polish forces are all entrenched. Neu-Divisions-Kommandeur version 2 is based on Korps-Kommandeur version 6, which in turn is a quick play version of Bruce Ree Taylor's Korps-Commander. The element scale is company. Unlike the two sets of rules it is based on, version 2 does not use strength points and is designed to be played on a smaller playing area. This shows the full development path, starting with a Korps-Commander Operational Manoeuvre Group and Korps-Commander The Road to Berlin, moving into Korps-Commander version 5 and then into the quick play version, Korps-Commander version 6. From that point on, a number of different rules were created, which each used different scales. The names of the rules represents the formation size a player would command. All these rules follow the strength point principle of the original Korps-Commander sets of rules, although in the battalion scale version each strength point represents an element, so that is the unintentional exception. Neu-Divisional-Kommandeur version 2 is the latest development where the concept of strength points have been removed entirely, and I have to admit it is so much easier and faster to play as a result. I may do the same with some of the other rules if I see a need, although with Neu-Korps-Commander I will probably not go down this path and instead move into a big base approach, with each strength point representing an entire element within a big base or a element tray. At a scale of one element is a battalion, the ground scale is very small. Moving to a big base means the scale returns to 1 in 10,000, which in some ways feels a bit better, but then results in a much larger playing area again. More playtesting will give me more clues which direction makes the most sense for these rules, but let's get back to the purpose of this video. Neu-Divisional-Kommandeur version 2 example of play. Actually, before I get into the play, while this picture is not micro-armour, this is actually the objective of all these rules that I've been working on and playtesting, etc. Being able to play a game while fully seated for the entire game, which currently requires a playing area of 2 by 3 feet, is really what I'm aiming for. I'm also looking at an 80 centimetre by 120 centimetre playing area, although this may be a bit deep, but the reason I'm doing that is because I've got sheets of insulation which are light and can basically is that dimension and could be an ideal playing area. Neu-Divisional-Kommandeur version 2 achieves this, as does Neu-Divisional-Kommandeur version 1 and Neu-Korps-Kommandeur version 1, and even other rules such as LWRS or the reformatted version Bewegungs-Krieg. Why do I want to do this? The answer is I want to use the figures I have painted and based. In a normal situation, or at least for the last 20 odd years I've been in the hobby, I spend an enormous amount of effort creating an army which I only really use perhaps a few times in a year against an opponent, if you're lucky. And when you do use them, often you only get a partial game because you are basically exhausted halfway through. A DBA type of game, which is what you see here, allows you to have several games in a day and lots more games as you can play on a smaller playing area in a wider range of venues. Anyway, now let's go back to the example game of Neu-Divisional-Kommandeur version 2. Before I go into the actual example of play, people may need to understand exactly what these rules entail, particularly if you're used to skirmish or platoon scale games. A good way of understanding a set of rules is to determine an element's movement allowance and weapons range. In this case, we are looking at the equipment within a Polish infantry division. The movement allowances are in centimetres, and you can see infantry can move 5 centimetres per action, with 2 actions being typical in a single game turn. The fully tracked C2P can move up to 16 centimetres per action, and a truck can travel 10 centimetres per action. As for weapons ranges, if we look at the 37mm WZ-36 anti-tank gun, it has a range of 4 centimetres, which represents its optimal range, and this can be doubled to 8 centimetres, which is its maximum range. If we look at the 81mm mortar, this has a range of 6 centimetres, which is its effective range, and this can be doubled to 12 centimetres, which represents its maximum range. The 75mm WZ-97 has a range of 20 centimetres, effective, doubled to 40 centimetres, which is its maximum. You can view the various values for each element here to give you an idea what type of distances you would typically be expected to cover and what range you would move up to before you close for close combat. It should be noted at this range the actual combats are mainly close assault. Long-range direct fire sniping is possible, but it really gets you nowhere in these sort of games. Just to note, the 75mm WZ-97 is probably the most effective anti-tank weapon the Polish possesses. However, it's more useful as an indirect in its indirect mode and is easy to see by the enemy, so it can be effectively countered with enemy indirect fire. Still, in my reading of reports in Belgium, the French 75mm gun were very effective against the poor old Panzer Is and Panzer IIs. So this does make sense, and in my playtest these weapons are real killers. But once again, it's a decision. Should I use them as anti-tank weapons, in which case the Germans try and avoid them, or should I use them as indirect weapons, which allows me to bring down indirect fire anywhere along the playing area? Anyway, a decision the Polish player needs to make. This shows the Polish deployment, with the Polish player edge being at the bottom of the screen and the German player edge being at the top. The Polish have decided to defend as far forward as possible. There are no reserves, however the artillery is able to support the entire front line, which is basically acting as the Polish reserves. The aircraft could also be considered to be acting as reserves, but in reality the Polish Air Force is really only there to try and minimise the effect of the German Air Force. It has to basically hold the Germans back for 3 game turns in order to have a chance of a draw or victory. The first phase is the initiative phase. During the reinforcement placement subphase, the Germans place all elements which are to enter the playing area on the player area edge. If elements removed from the playing area were returning, they would be placed in base-to-base contact with their respective headquarters. However, that's not occurring in this case. Both players determine supply. The Germans are automatically in supply, and after checking, all Polish elements are in supply. Both players determine initiative by spinning 2 d6 dice and applying any modifiers. The Germans have a quality of 3. Germans are the tactical attacker, so add 2, and are both the strategic and operational attackers, so add 2 more. They spin a 6, so the result is 13. The Polish have a quality of 3 and spin a 6 for a result of 9, because they've added their quality. The Germans win the initiative and require the Polish to move first. The difference, if the difference is less than 6, or the difference is less than 6, so there is no breakthrough. If the difference was greater than 6, then the Germans would get a breakthrough and get a third action, which is quite useful. The German roll is not a 2 or 12, so there's no weather change. On the first game turn, typically no one really deploys aircraft, so neither player does. Look, in some cases you could have a pre-planned mission with medium bombers or 4-engine bombers which basically pound the front line, but that uses up an enormous amount of points and is almost non-existent in any game I've ever played. The next is the artillery phase, and neither player uses artillery, although the Polish could have tried to conduct interdiction fire. They decide not to, as this uses up ammo, and the Germans would only be slightly disadvantaged, but it's still nonetheless a viable option. Typically, on the first game turn, the only artillery actions which may occur would be the attackers may do some area fire in areas where they think the defenders would be deployed, and the defenders would do interdiction fire in areas they think the attackers would need to move through in order to move rapidly. And during the Polish first player fire and movement phase, the Polish player does nothing. There's no point, and it's the reason why the Germans have selected the second player position in the first game turn. It is now the second player fire and movement phase, and the German forces move onto the playing area, all elements expending at least one action in order to conduct at least a single move. If we look on the German right flank, the Germans move their first Panzergrenadier regiment. This regiment does not have any tanks attached. It expends one action moving cross country 10 centimetres, and then in its second action moves an additional 6 centimetres and then dismounts just outside 4 centimetres of the Polish MMG. So no opportunity fire can occur. As the Germans have expended all actions, they cannot conduct any fire combat against the Polish elements, although this would not be very wise. The Germans are not taking cover as they lack the actions in order to take cover, so are a little bit exposed to return fire, so it's best not to. Incidentally, even the Polish MMG, if it decided to open fire, all that would happen is that the Germans could potentially bring down artillery fire against it. However, the Germans aren't really attacking in this sector, so that's why the Germans are staying just outside of 4 centimetre range, because they don't really want to be fired upon, because the MMG exposing itself provides the Germans no benefit in this particular case. On the German left flank, the 2nd Panzergrenadier Regiment, which has all the tanks attached, that is the tank battalion attached, moves forward 10 centimetres in the first action and 6 centimetres in the second action, so the front rank is 4 centimetres away from the Polish front line. They could move closer, but there's no point, and it's best to stay out of close range. At the end of game turn 1, this is the position of both forces. The last phase is the housekeeping phase. The only activity that occurs in this phase is the Germans are determined that they've achieved control of 2 tiles, thus gaining 2 VPs, and the game turn marker is advanced forward. Now, the VPs, you don't need to really do this religiously at the end of every single game turn. Generally, you will know what's being controlled at various times. The Germans only need to take control of a tile for the first time once, and they need to have control of the tile at the end of the game. So they're probably about the only 2 points in time that you need to really be fanatical about it, but nonetheless it's nice to see the victory point marker slowly advancing forward, so both players roughly knows how they're tracking. We now move into a game turn 2. There are no reinforcements here. All elements are in supply. The Germans spin a 7, so initiative value of 14. The Polish spin an 8, so initiative value of 10. Germans win but don't get breakthrough. They choose to be the first player. This is why they're not really that concerned about the distance from MMGs, etc. on that game turn. They've moved forward, they're not in cover, so they're exposed, but because they have control of the initiative, they can ensure that they have 2 movement phases, one after the other, which is a big advantage when launching an attack against a defended position. During the aircraft phase, the Germans deploy 3 dive bombers and 2 pass the quality test, so 1 returns available for next game turn and 2 remain on the playing area at their attack points. The Polish then deploy 3 fighters and 2 passes, 1 against each dive bomber. So if nothing else happened now, the Polish have sufficient fighters to neutralise the German dive bombers. However, the Germans now deploy their 3 fighters, and once again at 2 passes, 1 against each Polish fighter. So basically the fighters neutralise each other, which means the dive bombers can freely go ahead and start bombing away. The Polish have no AA, so we don't concern ourselves with it here, and they decide, or the Germans decide, to attack 2 elements with their dive bombers, which each have 3 ordnance per bombers, which will be in a dive bombing mode. The German Stukas have a bombing ordnance of 3, and because they are dive bombing, they gain a +2. The defenders are in cover and fortified, so that's a -2. The result is 3. Using the soft infantry row and the Germans can spin 4 dice. They achieve 3 hits against one and 1 hit against the other infantry. The Polish spin a 3 and 4 save die roll respectively. There is a disorder on the infantry which suffered the 3 hits and no effect on the infantry which suffered only 1 hit. It's hard to dislodge infantry dug in, but if you're lucky, it is very possible. The little string at the bottom there gives you all the modifiers and how you calculate combat. Now, all aircraft can actually launch a second strike. Now, the bombs are gone, but they can launch a strike using their machine guns. It's not a very strong firepower, but let's give it a go and see what happens. The German Stukas launch a second attack and have a gun FE of 2. The defenders are in cover and fortified, so that's -2. The result is 0. Using the soft infantry row, they spin only 3 dice, 2 hits against one and 1 against the other. The Polish spin a 4 and 3 save die roll and there is no effect. Just incidentally, to work out how this all works, if a infantry got a 2 hit, if the save die roll was a 1 or a 2, then basically they failed and it becomes disordered. However, in this case, that element spun a 4, so no problems. It's hard to dislodge infantry dug in, especially if you're just using guns, but what the heck? Why not give it a go? There's no anti-aircraft to cause us any difficulty in order to launch a second attack. There is no area interdiction or counter-battery fire this game turns, so there's no activity in the artillery phase. Because the Germans won the initiative, they selected to be the first player, which is critical. If they'd lost the initiative, they probably would be in a little bit of trouble, but it's pretty rare for that to occur. The Germans' first action is to bring down indirect fire. The 2 Panzer IIs act as observers and expend both actions, bringing down indirect fire on the 2 Polish infantry. Now, the Panzer IIs are 4 centimetres away, which means they can observe the infantry. It's important that that front line moves to a distance which allows them to see their target, otherwise indirect fire couldn't come down. Now, if any of these elements had opened fire for opportunity fire, then it would be a different story, but they were never given the opportunity to do that, so that was never possible. Okay, now the German artillery is attached to the regimental headquarters, so there is no quality test required. Now, this is a little bit dangerous. By allocating all the artillery to one regimental headquarters, it means the other regiment cannot take advantage of artillery fire. Even the divisional headquarters can't take advantage of artillery fire. But nonetheless, the Germans have decided that all their attacking will be done by this big Uber regiment, and the other regiment will be totally defensive. And that generally works in this scenario. The other issue is the artillery can never be used for counter-battery, but for this game, that's not really a major issue. The artillery is actually just off the playing area, in the centre of the attacking player edge, so the range is about 20 centimetres, and this is well within effective fire range of that artillery. The 10.5 centimetre LE FH-18s both spin 4 D6 dice with 3 hits and 2 hits respectively. They're very lucky. The Polish spin a 4 and 2, which results in disorder for one of the elements. The Germans, in their next fire range, remember they get 2 actions, will switch from the disordered infantry element to a infantry element which was not previously targeted. Now, just to get an idea of exactly how the combat system works here, the string that you see under the Polish forces tells you all you need to determine the fire combat. So you can first see a 10.5 centimetre LE FH-18 versus infantry. That tells you the attacker and the defender. It tells you the defender is an indirect soft target. The gun is an FE6. The row, which is effective range. The row used is soft infantry, which on column 6. Now modifiers, the target modifiers, cover and clutter to -1 each. Fire gets no modifier, which means the final column is 4. You cross-reference, you go down column 4 and you discover that gives you 4 D6 dice, which if you spin a 4 or greater on any of them results in a hit. For the second action, the element that was not disordered is hit again and another element is hit. The 10.5cm LE FH18 both spins 4 dice each with 3 hits and 2 hits respectively. The Polish spin a 4 and 2, which results in disorder for only one of the elements. So the indirect fire has achieved the disorder of 2 elements, which is actually a very good result considering these infantry are dug in fortification. Now, the Germans could conduct some direct fire from panzers which are not required in the close combat, but they've not deployed well and there's little point. Regardless, the real action at this scale is all close combat, and every single element that you see here, apart from the ones that have brought down indirect fire, needs to be involved in either close assault or providing close support, because that's what's going to give you a victory. Also, a quick note, because it was indirect fire that came down on the Polish infantry, there is no return or opportunity return fire, which is one reason why indirect fire is so useful. The Germans, in game turn 2, expend one action moving into close combat and a second action to initiate close combat. So basically what's occurring is every single element that will expend an action forward to go into base-to-base contact with their target and expend a second action which allows them to initiate the close combat. Every other element will expend one action to move in close support, which means it has to be in base-to-base contact with the close assault element and expend one action in order to provide close support. So what you see here, apart from the 2 Panzer IIes, which were involved in bringing down indirect fire, every single element is now either conducting close assault or close support. Now you'll see that in the centre and on the left of the screen here, that the elements have 2 elements providing close support. And this is allowed if you can actually move accordingly and have the movement points, etc. Now, the Polish have the option of conducting opportunity fire. Now, the front row is all armoured, and the Polish have no anti-tank weapon that can affect that armour at distance, with the exception of the 37mm WZ-36. Now, the 37mm can conduct 2 opportunity fire combats, because basically the 2 tanks that you can see being fired at have conducted sufficient movement to initiate opportunity fire. Now, you could actually launch both attacks against one tank, or in this case spread it between the 2. All the figures are down the bottom. So unfortunately for the Polish, the first attack, they spin 3 dice and achieve 1 hit. The Germans spin a 3, so there's no effect. And basically the same occurs with the Panzer IV, so opportunity fire has had no effect. If the Poles had been able to disorder one of the armour in opportunity fire, that would have basically significantly affected the combat. So it's still worth it in order to conduct opportunity fire. But in this case, it unfortunately didn't have sufficient impact to make a difference. Now we move to the close assaults, starting with the left and moving over to the right. The Panzer II spins 5d6 with 3 hits. The Polish player spins a 3, so is disordered. Hurrah for the Germans. The Polish infantry spins 3d6. This is the return fire for the Poles, or the return close assault. With 2 hits, the German player spins a 3. There is no effect. Not so good for the Poles. On the second round, both players decide to continue fighting. The Polish infantry is disordered, so the number of dice is halved, rounded up to 2. The Panzer II spins 5d6 and achieves 2 hit, but the Polish spins a 3 and there is no effect. The Polish infantry spins 2d6 dice and achieves 1 hit. Germans spin a 3 and there is no effect. On the third round, the Poles decide to retreat and vacates its position and moves 6 centimetres to a new position to the rear. The German elements all move forward 3 centimetres. The close combat has ended. Just a note, the Panzer IIs have 2 weapons, a 2cm cannon and a coaxial MG. In the close combat, it decided to use the MG as it gave a better FE value. At this scale, this level of detail is most certainly overkill. However, this provides an indication of the source of these rules. It also does not add that much complexity, so to avoid making any major changes in the basic game system, which did need this level of detail, it was retained in this particular game. The poor old Polish infantry only possesses anti-tank hand grenades, but even with this poor weapon is able to hold out rather well. If the Panzer II did not have any support, the Poles would have almost certainly won any close combat in its well-defended position. Just a quick note, there were 3 rounds for this combat. In most cases, the Polish forces would probably retreat as soon as it becomes disordered. If it decided to stick around and fight, it could become disrupted, which means it's removed from the playing area and could be returned. Well, it may not be returned, but if it is returned, it could be returned in 1, 2 or 3 game turns, which means that it's not on the playing area. By retreating, and because the Poles are the next, have the second fire movement phase, the Polish forces can expend an action to recover from disorder and then another action to get back into cover. So it allows the Poles to basically conduct a fighting withdrawal. We now move to the next element, which in this case is an unsupported Panzer IV-C. However, this tank is ideal for combat against infantry, which is the reason why it didn't have any support. It basically didn't need it. The Panzer IV spins 5 d6 dice with 3 hits. The Polish player spins a 2, so it's disordered. The Polish infantry spins 3 d6 with 2 hits. German player spins a 3, so there's no effect. In the second round, the German infantry decides to immediately retreat, moves back 6 centimetres, and the Germans occupy its position. Quick note, the German Panzer IV has 2 weapons, a 7.5cm firing HE and an MG. The 7.5cm is by far the superior weapon to use against infantry, so it's used in this case. In this combat, the Polish infantry is already disordered, which puts it in great danger. The Panzer IV spins 5 d6 with 2 hits. The Polish player spins a 2, so is disordered, and it's already disordered. It becomes disrupted and is removed from the playing area. The Polish infantry does get a shot before it disappears, and it spins 2 d6 with 1 hit. German player spins a 3, so there's no effect. The German occupies the position formerly held by the Polish infantry. We'll now run through the close combats more rapidly. For the next 2 close combats against the disordered infantry, or disordered Polish infantry, the first gets disordered again, becomes disrupted and is removed, but the third avoids disorder in the first round, so it immediately retreats. The additional 3 combats on the right are very different, with the Polish retreating disordered in one case, undisordered in the other case, and the last case the Germans have lost and they retreat disordered. The reason why the last 3 is tougher is because the Panzer IIs only have 1 element in support. This is the position at the end of the German firing movement phase. The Polish infantry, which are disordered, expend an action to recover from disorder and an action to take cover. The headquarters moves around a bit. The 37mm anti-tank gun expends 2 actions firing at the Panzer II, and the mortar expends 2 actions firing at the Panzer IIs as well. The 37mm anti-tank gun achieves 2 hits in each action, but in both cases the Germans spin a value greater than 2, so there's no effect. The Panzer II reply is their return fire, which is considered a type of opportunity fire, is equally ineffective. And the main reason for that is the opportunity fire modifier, which is a -2. The Polish 81mm mortar fires at the Panzer II. Now it self-observes here, it can see the Panzer, it doesn't need any element in front to expend actions in order to bring down fire, so it's actually doing the firing, but it is still indirect fire. In each action, it spins 3 d6 and achieves 1 hit in both attempts. The German spin value spins a value of more than 1 for each of the save, so there is no effect. As you can see, in these 4, it's very possible that, or probable, or it should have, one of them should have become disordered, and that does affect the Germans moderately significantly. Not massively, but it certainly does affect them. So it is definitely well worth firing with your anti-tank guns and firing with your mortars, even though it seems to be comparatively ineffectual at this point in time. During the housekeeping phase, the Polish spin a rally roll for their 3 disrupted infantry elements, spinning a 2, 3 and 4. 1 element is eliminated permanently, while 1 comes back in 2 game turns and the other in 3 game turns. Now this ends game turn 2, with game turn 3 now beginning. The Germans will almost certainly break through the remaining forces in front of them. The only question is how fast will they be able to do this. They have game turn 3 and game turn 4 to cut off the remaining Polish frontline supply and gain control of at least 5 tiles. This is difficult, but should be possible unless they spin very poorly. If the Polish reinforcements arrive on game turn 5, the Germans' advance will immediately stop. If they arrive on game turn 6, then they have a chance of taking all 6 tiles. That is, the Germans can take all 6 tiles. In retrospect, the Polish reinforcement die roll should be affected by how well the Germans do. So, in this case, they should arrive on game turn 5. If the Germans had not managed to take 5 tiles by game turn 4, then they should arrive on game turn 6. This is probably a recommended house rule. I didn't include it in my scenario because the complexity just goes through the roof, but nonetheless, it's a good way of balancing luck. Unless the Polish forces do very poorly, they should be able to push the Germans back to their half of the playing area, with the Germans achieving probably 8 victory points or a German substantive victory. If the Germans fail to take 5 tiles and get pushed back, it becomes a German marginal victory. And if the Polish manage to take 1 tile on the German side, which is a high probability, it becomes a draw, which is the most likely outcome of this game. In reality, what occurred was the Polish had some lousy die rolls and ended up with a German marginal victory, which is still not too bad. This video should give each player or players a feel for the gameplay or the game cycle. As can be seen, when the first major combat occurs, it becomes very complex and time-consuming. But once that is over, the game flows rapidly until the Polish forces counterattack. Big advantage of this 10 game turn or 12 game turn game is it can be easily completed in 4 hours, not including setup and pack-up time. It's not yet at the level of DBA, but that was not actually its original intention. Players could play a half game, excluding the Polish counterattack, which still results in a German victory, probably a marginal victory in this case, and which could probably be played in a 2-hour period. This game would be about 6 game turns in length. The concept of these rules is certainly viable, although players may still prefer a similar sized LWRS or Bewegunskrieg game, which is still simpler and easier to play than this. The only difference is these rules retain a great deal of the flavour of the weapons being used, so it really is a player choice. The ultimate conflict between playability and realism. The ultimate playable game is just 2 blocks with a die roll and that you spin each, and there's your game over. And of course that's not very attractive, and the ultimate historical game becomes something that you expend 8 hours simulating 2 minutes, which is also not acceptable. And finding the correct balance is a perennial issue. Denken Sie daran, immer für Heimatland zu kämpfen.